Okay, Robin, it's all yours now.
Great. Welcome to the Global Crackdown panel. This panel is part of a book project, and it's how freedom of speech and expression are being attacked globally, its far-reaching consequences, and what some of the things we might be able to do about it. I'm Robin Andersen, and I'm a writer, media critic, and educator, and I was based at Fordham for many years, and I've been a long-time associate of Project Censored as a judge and contributor to the annual book, and this year I wrote the news abuse chapter. We have three great other panelists here today with us, and I will introduce those people more as they get closer to their talks, but we have my colleague from Fordham, Arthur Hayes, who is going to talk about deplatforming and who is an associate professor at Fordham. And his research topics have been varied, but he does media ethics, media law, and his latest book is Communication in the Age of Trump. And Arthur also, of course, wrote the seminal work about media criticism organizations as the fifth estate. And he's going to be talking about deplatforming on Google and Twitter. Then Yahaya Ghanem is a journalist, an Egyptian former war correspondent, and a journalist in exile now living in Washington, D.C. And he's uniquely situated to talk about freedom of the press and its challenges, and the challenges also to freedom of expression throughout the Middle East, with a bit of a focus on Egypt.
Robin, I want to interrupt just for a moment. It's a little bit noisy and you sound very quiet. So if you could speak a little bit louder, and if everybody else could mute their mic, I think that will help all of us hear better.
Oh, that's usually never my problem. Okay, so I'm going to start then with just framing the topic a little bit. Our goal is to look at the many forms and places where civil liberties and freedom of expression are currently under attack around the world. In the United States, we're going to talk with Donald Trump. He continues to discredit journalists, attack media outlets, and broadcast fake news from the highest office in the land. At the same time, his administration condones the actions of dictators around the globe as they close down freedom of speech to those who would disseminate factual information. Around the world, public debate suffers and the voices of global citizens are increasingly silenced. If we look at what the Trump administration has been doing to the Julian Assange, the journalist and founder of WikiLeaks, I think it will be a good way to start talking about what the United States does and how its willingness to censor journalists, take the censorship of journalism really to another step with the prosecution of Julian Assange will give us a sense of how dramatic the events are becoming here. Don't forget that Julian Assange published factual information on WikiLeaks. He is currently under trial or having a hearing in the UK for extradition to the United States. Keep in mind that Julian Assange is an Australian citizen, and he did not publish from the United States, but he is requesting that the UK extradite Assange because the United States does not like the things that he has said about the United States. And if they got him back on the Espionage Act, really there is no due process, there's no way that he could fight the charges against him, and they would disappear him into a supermax prison. So for the first time in US history, a journalist is being indicted for publishing truthful information. It's also important to remember that he's not a whistleblower. He is a journalist. His information about the war in Iraq and the war logs came from Chelsea Manning. Journalists in the US have been protected and allowed, a long history, allowed to publish information even if that material was obtained by some other source. So now they're claiming that he could not publish that. Indeed, the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize for the story based on WikiLeaks. So if they can do it to WikiLeaks, they can certainly expand that at any moment after that to any news organization that they don't think is treating them fairly. That is to say, any news organization that is publishing critical information to the United States, be it truthful or not, and of course it is. So the incarceration and torture of Julian Assange, as the world watches, exposes government corruption and brutality, has been far, far dangerous, not only in the United States, but around the world. Journalists continue to be penalized, incarcerated in the US, and worse, killed around the world. If we look what's been happening in the United States under the Trump administration as well, police have been targeting journalists specifically in the protests subsequent to George Floyd's murder and at all kinds of Black Lives Matter demonstration and protests. Journalists have been deliberately targeted, reporters, news photographers described being rounded up, arrested, and shot with projectiles while covering demonstrations across the country. The US Press Freedom Tracker has documented 300 total press incidents, 192 assaults, 160 by police, equipment damage, 42, 43 physical attacks by cops against journalists, 24 pepper spraying, and 77 rubber bullets and projectiles. And oftentimes journalists, as you know, they're wearing press ID and they're deliberately targeted. Al Jazeera has pointed out police have hit dozens of journalists with tear gas and pepper spray as they are wearing credentials. In addition, a new report by Civicus, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation, published by Interpress Service, has sounded an alarm in the age of COVID globally about how increasingly repressive governments are attempting to and actually succeeding in keeping information about the pandemic away from the public by censoring and excluding voices of scientists and others from the news frame. So they have detailed the ways in which global pandemic has exposed harsh measures to crack down on civic freedoms and the free press in many countries. Assessing the situation 6 months after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, governments are continuing to waste precious time and resources restricting human rights rather than fighting the virus. Even free-flowing information and unrestricted speech are vital during a pandemic, as we know. If we look at the countries that have succeeded in fighting the pandemic, such as in New Zealand, there's a female prime minister and she has now been elected unanimously, with a landslide victory, not unanimously, with a landslide victory in New Zealand because of her treatment of sharing information with her citizens, on a daily and often weekly basis, and informing them, and has really controlled the virus. So what we see are governments who haven't been doing the right thing, particularly with the pandemic, have been closing down its critics and closing down also scientists who are trying to get information out. And I think that we can observe that at least that's one of the reasons that the pandemic has been so contagious and been such a terrible killer. We can also, let's look just as an example of one country. Of course, Turkey has never had a very good track record dealing with journalists. But even before the pandemic, Turkey was the #1 jailer of journalists in the world, with about 165 journalists currently behind bars. The government's crackdown on the media has continued, with journalists being jailed on charges of, and this is particularly about the pandemic, causing people to panic and publishing reports on coronavirus outside the knowledge of authorities. So thousands of social media accounts have been placed under surveillance or just taken off. citizens detained for unfounded provocative posts caused very much worry about the public and the international community and the Committee to Protect Journalists. So what we see is, for the longest time, the United States exported the idea of freedom of the press and freedom of speech as a primary characteristic and element of its foreign policy through the State Department. And we used to require that governments at least gave some kind of nod to freedom of expression and freedom of speech. However, under the Trump administration, with the prosecution of Julian Assange, with the direct attack against journalists throughout their administration, and now the rolling back of any kind of international pressure on quote unquote allies to protect journalists. In fact, what we see is some of the Trump administration's favorite governments are doing the worst kinds of things in Brazil, in India, in various places around the globe. So what we also see is that the truthful information, it doesn't matter whether it's false or true in terms of the journalist crackdown, but what we find is the Trump administration has gained power and continues to feed a certain number of constituents in the United States with lies, conspiracy theories, and the worst kind of white supremacist toxic masculinity. And all of these things, what we'll find is having an effect of other countries following suit and seeing what the United States president can get away with. Recently, I think what we've also seen is the idea of fake news having now been targeted as something that is going to be censored through Facebook and Twitter. And recently there was a article by Glenn Greenwald in The Intercept, and what he pointed out was that Twitter and Facebook have censored over both platforms a story about Hunter Biden and identified it as fake news and a conspiracy theory. So we see this expanding. We see this kind of censorship now going from the government into private, the biggest private corporations that arguably actually control so much of what we see on the media. And so my colleague from Fordham University, Arthur Hayes, is going to address that with a deplatforming piece that he wrote that will be contributed to the book on global crackdown. So here he is.
Yeah. All right. I'm unmuted. Okay. All right. Well, I'm not going to directly address issues concerning Assange, but somewhat with Twitter, and also I'm addressing more about what's happening in other nations with regards to censorship, online censorship. Right? We haven't gone as far as other nations have in attempting to censor online speech. All right, so what I've dubbed this current trend is the great firewall of China syndrome. Others who study this area have called it the Great Berlin Wall, because Germany has a very draconian law with regards to free speech on the line. So basically, so I'll talk about the Chinese firewall, how it operates, its focus. Germany, briefly, I'll mention Germany's network enforcement law. I'll talk about the short-lived France fighting hate on the internet law, which gives us possibly a template in how to challenge this trend among nations. And then I'll also talk about shutdowns. All right, so these efforts, so the key efforts are that mimic China's approach, is that governments now put the onus on the online intermediary, right? And in effect, they make that online intermediary a police and a court, right? Adjudicate what, so that's one of the key problems and weaknesses of these laws, that they're transferring the state power to these private entities, right? And they're not giving them due process in the past. Two, we'll talk about, so some these countries that I say mimic China and are going down this road toward having these authoritarian systems, and they're supposedly liberal democracies, are Germany, Austria, Turkey, New Zealand, India, UK to some degree, and certainly France, but that French law was struck down recently. And it's the first time we've had this judicial response to this new variety of laws. But these new variety of laws, again, as I said, they put the onus on the intermediary, right? And they are, in essence, and what they use hate speech and speech that supposedly encourages terrorism as stalking horses to either currently crack down on legitimate political dissent, or gives a state the potential to crack down on political dissent. I'm one who is opposed to the non-American banning of hate speech laws. And I think what goes on, what we see consistently since they were enacted in the 1990s in Europe and England, is that the problem is that you give a state the ability to determine what's hateful speech. And of course, most states will say it's from the left. That something political statement, people say criticism will be hateful speech. When we see this over and over again, yet Europe is convinced that's the way to go. And apparently more and more Americans like the idea that someone should be either jailed or somehow censored in some way because they would say, for me, use the N-word, or they use that kind of thing. And I'm opposed to it. I think that's free speech, and that should be, and I believe in the marketplace of ideas, not into the sense that the truth will always bear out. But I think it's better to have individuals in a democracy debating this rather than have a government, a regime come in and say, oh, today we think that everything that Black Lives Matter says is hate speech. Right? It could always turn. It could, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the speech that you prefer, right? So that's one of the dangers. All right, so China, and also the China firewall is about 20 years old. So it is this roadmap. There are all reactions again to hate speech, disinformation, propaganda, right? And even what this ambiguous term, harmful speech, which they are now considering in England and other places, which goes beyond what US law considers harmful speech, which would be incitement, right? Which would be, and things of that nature, incitement. And they're vague, ill-defined. Therein lies another danger. What's harmful speech? And generally under our law, offensive speech is not harmful, right? You can offend other people, right? That's protected speech. But that's not the case when you had this vague category called harmful speech. All right, so again, they're going after hate speech, propaganda, disinformation, terror, even news, such as the Christchurch terroristic act, which New Zealand and Australia, I think it was New Zealand certainly, and Australia cut off the streaming of it, right? This is a very worthy news event. And so somehow seeing what the argument that, well, if you allow that to stream, then it's going to encourage others. Well, how do you know that? Maybe by allowing it to stream, you'll have the opposite effect. You'll have more people say how horrible this is. We need to do something about this terrorist group, right? So there's assumption that by having that assault not being, but it continued with, well, then why stop there? Let's not have gruesome photos of war. Let's not have gruesome videos of war. But again, the public needs to know. Some people will see when they actually see what a war is like, how gruesome it can be, they may change their opinion about whether that particular war is justified or not. Consider what happened in the 60s when we learned about the killing of innocent civilians in Cali, how that information changed a lot of people's idea about whether that was a just war. All right, so we had that. So I use that China's effort. And again, this thing about terrorism, it's so thinly veiled what China's model's doing, because they see the Muslim minority in China, right, as being a terrorist. And so they're using that to crack down on the Muslim minority in China. Right? And I would say that Muslim minority has legitimate grievances and they should be aired, but China doesn't want them to air that. So again, this is a tool, these new laws, and these new laws are based on the assumption that somehow speech online is somehow more harmful than speech in the real world. I don't accept that form of cyber exceptionalism, right? I think it's not, it just can't be proven that it's different. I understand it's the argument, oh, speech goes faster on the internet, so and so. But again, this whole argument about, oh, someone has propaganda and so and so. For those who are on the left, well, we know these publications have been reread for decades, would be considered propaganda, right, by the right. So we want to give the government the power to say that the Progressive magazine or In These Times or Jacobin is, or The Nation is propaganda, right? No, it's just legitimate political dissent and political speech, and people should be able to discuss that. All right, so we have, is my time up? Is that what it is?
I think you're just about there, but you've got a minute or two.
Quickly, I wanted to
that told us that Steve had arrived.
Okay, I quickly want to talk about the French. The French passed the law, and it was struck down last year. It was struck down by its court very quickly. All right, and that gives us a template for going after a lot of these this new form of censorship. And basically, it's that these laws are impermissible prior restraints. They're overbroad, they're vague, and under the international law, they have a term called disproportionate, right? Disproportionate. What they're going after, the means that they're choosing is disproportionate to the supposed harm. And so I would look at that process there, what happened in the courts and before the courts, as a way of addressing these new forms of censorship. Thank you.
So Arthur, I've got to just ask you a really quick question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Using by people asking government and legislators to create laws that would essentially allow Facebook and Twitter to ban so-called hate speech. That's how it applies to current discussions about policy, about what to do with, about the kind of current hysteria about what to do with everything on Facebook and Twitter, right?
Right. I don't think the U.S. government should be involved with telling Facebook and Twitter what's, certainly not hate speech because that's legal, but all these other issues of speech. The only thing I would say about Twitter and Facebook is that I'm for removing the Section 230 immunity protection, and then they can be sued by individuals. They wouldn't be protected. So again, but what is the concern that somehow, even the notion that we see with QAnon and all these things, are they really, I mean, what is the impact of QAnon? It is not QAnon, it's Trump and Fox, who are part of that network propaganda, to use Yale, I think it's Harvard or Yale professor's book about this. They're more dangerous with repeating the conspiracy theories and unfounded theories. So do we shut down Fox? Okay, yes, many of us would like to, but no, Fox has a First Amendment right to spread its propaganda, right? So I don't see social media as being that threat to citizens being able to make intelligent decisions.
Great. Okay, well, we do have Steve Masik on the line now, so he should really be considered the co-host of the panel because, as I said, mentioned, this is a book project, and Steve is a co-editor. His talk is about how attacking freedom of expression in colleges and campuses around the United States is being carried out by the right.
Yeah, I'm actually going to talk about around the world.
And around the world, exactly.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
good.
Can you all hear me? Yeah, can you all hear me okay? Because I have to come to you through my phone because
Yes,
I
you
couldn't
sound
get
good.
Zoom through the computer. Okay, fine.
All right, Steve, I'll let you finish introducing yourself then.
Okay, all right, sorry. I
okay.
apologize that I'm late to the party because Zoom would not let me connect through my computer, even though I was on a panel just a half an hour ago where it did allow me to connect. So go figure. Anyway, I'm Steve Masik. Thank you, Robin, and thank you for everyone for being here. I'm going to speak about the global crackdown on universities, academic freedom, and critical scholarship as a component of what Robin and Arthur have described as this global attack on free expression. And my general thesis is that the attack on academic freedom in universities is being driven these days primarily by authoritarian right-wing nationalist political movements and politicians. Yes, countries like China and North Korea, don't really have academic freedom. But the interesting new development is the rise of right-wing nationalist political parties and politicians who are dead set against academic freedom. Let me first define my terms. By academic freedom, I mean the freedom of scholars to conduct research, to publish their findings, to teach their subjects as they wish without interference from outside, outside pressure groups, and to express themselves on matters of public concern freely and without fear of censure or retribution. It also means for students the freedom to choose what to study, to speak their minds, to share their views in and outside the classroom without fear, and to participate in civic and political associations without interference. I also mean by academic freedom the freedom of institutions of higher learning to operate without extensive or government or political interference. Now, a cursory glance at the recently revealed or unveiled Academic Freedom Index, which is a database that was produced by Scholars at Risk, Friedrich Alexander University, and the Global Policy Institute that tracks these and other indicators and components of academic freedom from 1900 to the present for some 130 countries, suggests that academic freedom around the world dramatically improved in the early 1990s, but has lately either plateaued or in some countries begun to decline. And if you look very closely at the country level data that the Academic Freedom Index has collected, it reveals something quite alarming. In several very large industrialized countries that previously had excellent university systems, but are now currently under control of right-wing nationalist political leaders, from India and Turkey to Russia, Ukraine, and Hungary to Brazil, academic freedom is deteriorating rapidly. Take Turkey, which I know Robin mentioned in connection with freedom of the press. Under the authoritarian government of Recep Erdogan, thousands of academics have been fired, hundreds have been persecuted and sent to jail for their political views. Human Rights Watch has reported that, quote, since the 2016 coup attempt, more than 5,800 academics have been dismissed from public universities under emergency decrees as part of a general crackdown on public employees with alleged ties to terrorist organizations. And we know that even family members of expatriate Turkish intellectual dissidents and scholars and academics were critical of Erdogan, right? Family members who are still living in Turkey face harassment and threats from Turkey's Secret Service for the views that are being articulated by their family members overseas. Take India. Since the right-wing BJP, Hindu Nationalist Party, took power, whole topics have been ruled off limits as part of the curricula at Indian universities. Novels and documentary films that touch on the Indian Army's occupation of Kashmir, the persecution of the country's Muslim minority, and events such as the destruction of a mosque in Ayodhya have been struck from the curriculum. Scholarly monographs written by esteemed scholars like Wendy Donnelly that are seen as hostile to Hinduism have been banned from the curriculum entirely. Take Russia, which is a really egregious case. If you look at the Academic Freedom Index, Russia now ranks even lower than India in terms of academic freedom. They're barely ahead of Saudi Arabia on the Academic Freedom Index. In Russia, prominent academics and student activists have been arrested, beaten, and worse for voicing concerns or criticisms of the Putin regime or for questioning certain aspects of official policy. In addition, Putin's government has recently put in place rules that limit cross-national collaboration between Russian scientists and their international counterparts. And these rules are just kind of astounding. They sort of harken back to the worst days of sort of Stalinism, right? The rules restrict Russian scientists' contact with foreigners by requiring them to notify the education ministry about any such meetings, to ensure that at least 2 Russians are present at any such meetings, and to report the content of the conversations that actually took place to the education ministry. It's chilling. Globally, scholars whose work is informed by feminism or who work in the areas of gender studies and or queer studies have found themselves singled out for particularly harsh attacks. And I think there's some really obvious reasons why that's the case, because feminism and gender studies threatens the right because it exposes how socially constructed identity markers of gender, race, class, sexuality are used to naturalize and legitimate power structures and oppressive institutions like the traditional patriarchal family that the right desperately wants to preserve. So in Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban, once a liberal reformer and now an ardent right-wing nationalist and political anti-Semite, in October of 2018 issued a government decree effectively prohibiting gender studies at all universities in the country. His deputy prime minister, Zsolt Semjen, said gender studies, quote, has no business being taught in universities because it is, quote, an ideology, not a science. In Brazil, the current president, Jair Bolsonaro of the Nationalist Alliance for Brazil, has promised to, quote, liberate the country from, quote, gender ideology and, quote, political correctness. Sound familiar? There's a bill that's actually being considered by the Brazilian legislature that would bar the teaching of topics related to gender in schools from K through 12 in 2 universities. And Brazilian scholars who do research on gender issues have been subject to relentless harassment. For example, Brazilian academic Marcia Tiburi, author of How to Speak to Fascists and Women in Philosophy, was fired from her job at Mackenzie Presbyterian University, and she suspects that was for speaking at a rally in support of abortion rights. She subsequently was forced to flee to Paris after receiving hundreds of death threats. Now, this kind of attack on universities, on critical scholars, and on academic freedom, is happening all around the world. But of course, we know it's also happening here. And here in the United States, President Donald Trump and his allies and supporters, like their authoritarian counterparts in Brazil, Russia, and Hungary have waged an unending war against universities, academics, and academic freedom. And I could go on and on and on about this. Indeed, just as recently as July 10th, President Trump tweeted that, quote, "Too many universities and school systems are about radical left indoctrination, not education. Therefore, I am telling the Treasury to re-examine their tax-exempt status." Just a couple of examples, because I know I'm probably over my time to conclude here. In remarks that he made at a speech at the National Archives in mid-September, Trump attacked the New York Times Magazine's 1619 Project, which some of you may know, reframes American history by focusing on the consequences of slavery and the experiences and contributions to American history of African Americans. The 1619 Project is being incorporated into curricula and being talked about at both the K-12 level and in colleges and universities around the country. And Trump, in his remarks, charged that the project, quote, "rewrites American history to teach our children that we were founded on the principle of oppression, not freedom." It was an example of the way that, quote, "the left has warped, distorted, and defiled the American story with deceptions, falsehoods, and lies." And he announced that he would sign an executive order establishing a national commission to promote national patriotic education. And that he mentioned that he had already, through the National Endowment for the Humanities, made awards to support the development of, quote, pro-America curriculum. Just another kind of quick example of how he has sort of attacked or tried to tamper with what is being taught in schools and universities. Last year, Trump signed an executive order on anti-Semitism that essentially equated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And critical commentators have pointed out that one effect of, and would deny federal funds to colleges where students are not, quote, protected from anti-Semitism as defined by his executive order. Commentators have pointed out that one effect of this executive order could be that colleges and universities will be prohibited from inviting pro-Palestinian speakers or speakers that advocate boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. And they may not be even allowed to recognize Palestinian student groups if those groups were openly critical of Israel. So everywhere around the world, we are facing an onslaught and an attack on academic freedom. And that's where I'm going to end, because I know I'm over time. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, now we go back to journalism with Yahaya Ghanem, who is a former war correspondent working in Egypt, and he became the victim of a military-driven trial in Egypt, and he was charged with actually training professional journalists in the and he has been in exile since then. Done an enormous amount of research and watching the dictatorship in Egypt now of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and has been tracking what's going on in the Middle East with the rollback of freedom of expression and the jailing and oftentimes worse than that in journalists. So Yahya, I just want to show you that this is his book that just came out in the series I co-edit, called Media and Humanitarian Action. It's a focus book series, and this is the new book. And it is titled Al Jazeera, Freedom of Expression and Forecasting Humanitarian Emergencies. And really, ultimately, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the difference between humanitarianism, and all kinds of human rights and repression. So Yahya, I would like to ask you, how is it happening in Egypt in terms of the rollback of public discourse in the public sphere within Egypt through privatization? What's been happening as an example for us that we haven't really talked about yet, about how media outlets have been partnering with basically the forces of repression?
Well, thank you very much for hosting me. But could I ask you kindly to stop recording, because what I'm going to say might be harmful to my family back in Egypt.
Do we have any questions from the audience, from people online or watching or listening? Yeah. No text are coming in. Well, let's ask Arthur. Do you think that the ways in which is somebody trying to jump in? Rob, are you trying to jump in? How do we stop this? How can we fight either legally or through participation or through in academia or any place where we can think about what can we do? How can we direct resources to protecting freedom of speech? Any ideas? Arthur, Steve?
Can you hear me?
Oh, there's a very strange reverb.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that we can do. One is to participate in organizations, like Scholars at Risk, which, provides support for example, scholars in countries like Turkey, Russia, India, China, who are being persecuted. And there are similar kinds of organizations that provide support for journalists who are under attack. I mean, I think those are important efforts, especially for those of us, in fairly wealthy countries whose free speech rights are secure. Those are some of the things that we can do and provide material support.
Right. I mean, it probably makes sense.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Well, I mean, there are a couple of measures that I have been thinking about, for years, and the questions that I kept asking myself. I mean, we journalists, we work under pressure and under stress, all different kinds of stresses and pressures. And it's not just a risky business. It's very dangerous, and especially in certain parts of the world. And I always ask myself this question: why diplomats have immunity under the Vienna Convention, and we don't have it? I mean, yeah, I know that there are many organizations that work in the field of protecting or trying to protect. Actually, they're not protecting. Uh, Definitely, they didn't protect me. They didn't protect my family. When I was arrested several times, countless times, when I was tortured countless times, when I was politically charged and stood trial for 2 years in a cage, nobody protected me. Yes, some organizations talked, some organizations tried to shame that regime. But what's the use of shaming regimes that are already shameful? I mean, it's no use. Why not thinking about an international convention that gives immunity? I'm not asking for an absolute immunity. I'm talking about immunity when we work in the field. I believe, I truly believe, I strongly believe that our work is not less important, definitely not less important than the diplomats. So why not think about that? Why not calling for an international convention to protect and to punish by the law, international convention, punish the perpetrators who kill journalists in cold blood, murder them, punish them for just telling the truth. I think we should seriously think about such a step. Um,
You mean
uh,
something like through the United Nations, the
yes,
convention,
definitely,
something like that.
definitely.
That's
I'm done with the United Nations organizations, making statements condemning the jailing or illegal
right.
jailing of journalists. No, 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 no. That's not enough.
Right.
Personally, that doesn't appeal to me. It's not enough. This is hypocrisy. For me, now I can say it confidently, this is hypocrisy, mendacity. I'm sorry to be angry, but I'm angry for not for my fellow journalists.
Right.
I've seen many of my friends murdered, and two of them in front of my eyes. No, this is not acceptable. And what we are having nowadays, no, it's not enough. I mean, our mission as journalists, as I know it, is to stop the dictators and murderers of tomorrow from being born today. And I believe this is a holy mission that needs to be protected,
I
not
couldn't
just by
agree more.
statements. Excuse
I
me?
couldn't, I said I couldn't agree more. I think you're right. I think, Scholars Without Risk, reporters without, Scholars at Risk, Reporters Without Borders, they can only shame these people. And as you said, they are shameless. And so I think more
Exactly.
stringent measures need to be taken. I think that's an excellent point.
I do too. I'm surprised it hasn't been posited yet.
I mean, are we supposed to be martyrs?
Right.
Okay, okay. I don't mind to be a martyr, but no, I'm strongly opposed to the idea of, having my other colleagues being martyrs. There's no need for us to be martyrs.
Right. Good. Thank you. Jeff,
Absolutely
we've
right.
reached our time. Should we stop?
So our time is up. If you want to go for a few more minutes, that's okay. But the session was slated to go to 12:30. You're free to use this platform to continue if you'd like for a few more minutes.
Great. Thanks. Arthur, from a legal perspective, since you're the expert in media law, do you think that what do you think about Yahia's suggestion, or do you have any ideas about how we could, I don't know, is there anything we could do about Trump lying, for example?
Well, it's hard to think how, other than going to treating those in nations such as Egypt and elsewhere who are killing journalists, is to make it a war crime and bring them into a war crime court. All right. And I'm not sure, off the top of my head, I don't know if there's ever been figures in other nations who were tried for killing journalists. It might be part of the overall, efforts of genocide, alleged genocides and such, but I don't know enough specifically of in the international courts in The Hague and such, has anyone ever been accused of systematically killing journalists as that
No.
being a international crime? That might be.
With all due respect, I believe that what I was talking about has nothing to do with The Hague. Uh, because there would be some legal issues when it comes to that, because there are many countries, actually most of the countries in the world, have not signed or ratified the Rome law, which actually regulates the work of that court, criminal court. I think we should be thinking about something else, some other body that takes care of those journalists who are being murdered, not killed, murdered, arrested, illegally arrested, detained, tortured, And we should be thinking about another body setting up another body within the United Nations that should be armed with teeth, not just like many other bodies within the United Nations that are teethless.
It's interesting. One of our participants in the chat room has also lots. They're thanking you, Yahya, for your suggestions and saying, what if we also rethought research designs to kind of get a critical knowledge about all that's happening? Maybe have a centralized information source that can then use that information to, let's say, propose. Try to find a way to do it that you're suggesting, possibly outside the parameters of the United Nations.
That's a good way to start it. Yes, yes, I support this. Because you see, Robin, it's not, they are not going to stop, and we shouldn't stop as well. I mean, because if we stop, they win. I mean, we have an old saying back in Africa that says that if you are bent to cross the river, don't think about the crocodiles. There will always be crocodiles in the river, and crocodiles bite. Okay, so there will always be some of our tribe trying to cross the river. It's our responsibility to try to minimize the risk of the crocodiles in the river for those courageous people who try to represent us. I'm sorry, I'm an African, so I use crocodiles in the rivers as a metaphor. It's a bit wild, but this is the truth. I mean, we're facing crocodiles, at least in the Middle East and Africa.
Well, and more than that, I mean, crocodiles come in a lot of different forms. They come in as drug lords. They come in as corporations pushing
Definitely,
environmental
of
defenders
course.
on the land who are trying to bear witness. They come, from governments. They come from all different places in the military. So
Yeah, exactly.
we do really need to I think, figure out or find a way to talk about trying to protect the people who are bearing witness to all of the injustices that are being perpetrated around the globe at this moment. Given that we have an increasingly vociferous kind of corporate global capital that is demanding to take every last bit of thing they can get from us and from the globe, and it's only getting worse. So we really need to think about how to protect those that bear witness.
Exactly.
And that's what I have to say. Anybody else? Okay, thank you so much for participating, Yahya, Steve, Arthur, and thank you for all those who listened. And see you down the road.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you for all the panelists. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you to everyone. This was a fabulous, excellent panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.